All right, chapter 28, Russia and Japan. And this is also the last chapter in Unit 6, so responses to industrialization. And we're going to be basically talking about how Russia and Japan responded now to a more industrialized Europe, mainly England and France. All right, so Russia is going to struggle with modernization. All right, we've already kind of talked about Russia's struggles a little bit in the industrialization chapter. We're just going to go into a little bit more detail and talk about how they kind of try to do some reforms, sort of similar to the Ottomans. You know, the Ottomans tried their reforms, the Tanzimat reforms. It's going to end up about the same, not widely successful. Tried to hold on to their conservative past while the world was moving on. They were trying to hold on to feudalism specifically way longer than they should have. Japan's going to go an entirely different direction, basically unlike everyone else in the world we've talked about. Japan will become, it's going to be attacked through imperialism and industrialization from Europe. It's going to be America specifically, but it's rather than resist and crumble, it's going to almost embrace it, and as a result, Japan will become more powerful. Japan will actually become a threat to the European powers and America. Spoilers, World War II and things like that. But that's later on. This is how we're building up to, how Japan, a country in Asia, on the other side of the world from where industrialization began, how Japan went from feudalism basically and holding on to this old system and being very isolated to being a power that could threaten the Western world. So it's a much different story. It's an interesting story. All right, so Russia first. All right, so Russian resistance. We've talked about this a little bit. It started with Catherine the Great. So the French Revolution goes on in Western Europe, and many of the Russian czars, czarinas, Catherine and other ones following in the 19th century looked at that and said, no. All that crazy revolutionary stuff going on in Western Europe, we don't want it, right? They wanted to keep their heads on their bodies, but they wanted to maintain their traditional way of life. So they wanted to avoid all the chaos of the 19th century. And what does that mean? Well, that meant that they were going to be very, very strict. Secret police that would arrest people who possibly were rabble rousers or maybe had different ideas. Newspapers and books were censored, meaning that they were, they weren't allowed. They either weren't printed or they had to have things removed before they would be printed. Supervised schools, which means that you would have a government official, military official, oftentimes inside of your school, watching your teacher to make sure that they weren't teaching anything that could have been revolutionary. And then they oftentimes would send troops to stop revolt in neighboring countries. Now, I want to point this out. Some of you may have figured this out. A lot of these things are the same thing that totalitarian dictatorships are going to do in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as well, too. I mean, this could be the communist Stalinistic regime. This could be fascist Germany. This is all very similar stuff. Spanish Civil War, would be a fascist example of this sort of stuff. All of the 20th century Soviet Union policies of the Warsaw Pact would be involved in this as well too. So these policies that the czars are running in early 19th century Russia are very similar to the totalitarian states that we know to hate in the 20th century. Very similar. Early on in the 19th century, there is going to be an uprising. The liberal faction in the military, who went by the name the Decembrists, tried to basically do a coup and try to overthrow the government and try to push for more liberal reforms, more Western European style reforms. They wanted to challenge it. This is not the Decembrists. This is the band, the Decembrists. In the 2000s, for whatever reason, there was a push to make there was a lot of indie bands, especially, who took their names from historical figures. The Decembrists are pretty cool, though. You might want to check them out. But anyways, the Decembrists were put down very violently. So this is a liberal military faction. They tried to rise up, and the Tsar squashes them like bugs because they can't have this kind of revolt, especially in their own military. Meanwhile, harsh policies against Jewish people, Catholic Polish populations, anybody who might have something that's slightly different than Russian-speaking Russian Orthodox religion, because they're trying to stop all the nationalistic bits in Russia. Russia is an incredibly diverse country, religiously, linguistically, ethnically. It's a huge country. At this time period, the only country, and probably still to this day, the only country more diverse than Russia is the United States of America, a country made up of immigrants. Russia, just by its nature, is very diverse, and they were running into problems with nationalistic groups. People, especially in like Catholic Poland, were saying, in the Polish region, were saying, hey, we should be separate. We should have our own thing. We don't want to be ruled by Russian Orthodoxy leaders. And the Jewish populations were the same way. And as a result, pogroms, state-sanctioned violence against these groups was very common, and they restricted their lives. Meanwhile, Russian economy. So Russia maintains feudalism way longer than anybody else. Like they're still going to be they're going to be finishing feudalism, like serfs and stuff. The medieval age basically. They're going to be finishing that when America is finishing the Civil War, right? We're going to be ending slavery. They still had serfs. Um, that's around the same time period. If that helps you put it in put it in your mind. Look at this picture here. Keep in mind this is a picture. So pictures come from cameras, right? So this is from a time period where we had the technology to take pictures, and these are Russian serfs um, who look like they would be medieval peasants almost, and they are doing the work that in the West either an animal or most likely now increasingly tractors and other machines would be doing. We had camera technology. This isn't that old, and we see these people here tied up like beasts. So, anyways, Russia is going to maintain this feudal system. Why were they doing this? Well, fear of change. They didn't want change. And if you are a Russian lord, if you're part of the aristocracy, you're benefiting from the traditional way of life. You want land to be the main power and wealth source of your country. You don't want industry. You don't want factories. You don't want this new bourgeoisie class rising up. Who have money and power that is separate from your traditional power source. You want titles and things like that. You want that to be all the power. So they feared losing that power. Think like Brazil, or even think like the southern states of the United States of America, places that held on to slavery for a long time period, even though it was antiquated and morally corrupt, just like feudalism and serfdom. They were holding on to these systems because that's where their power was. So it's going to take a lot of changes to change these things. Russian economy is almost entirely agricultural. Very little factories at all. And once again, this was resisted. And because the serfs, the poorer people, had almost no money and almost no capital, they couldn't build their own factories. And there was no incentive for the lords, for the people who owned the land in Russia, to build factories. They wanted to keep things the same way. So they own almost entirely agricultural economy. Now that doesn't mean that finished goods weren't in Russia. Okay, they will have weaponry and things like that. They'll have clothes, but they're usually imported from Western Europe. They'll be coming from Western European factories and at great cost. Once again, you might make some similarities here. This is very similar to the Ottoman Empire. When the Ottomans were collapsing, they ran into the same trap. Few factories using Western-made machines, so even the machinery, if they did have a factory, would be using machines made in the West. Brute force labor was preferred. All right, so all that's going on, and then the mid-19th century, the Crimean War. So the Crimean Peninsula, all right. So the Crimean War, it's going to be fought in a few other here's a map, obviously. It's fought in a few other places, but it's mainly focusing around Crimean Peninsula right here, which, if you've been following the news in the last few years, is still kind of a hot button issue for Russia. But anyways, the Ottoman Empire is on the decline, and we've talked about that. They've already lost Greece at this point. They are the sick man of Europe. They're losing territory and falling apart on the inside. And Russia looks at this as an opportunity. So the Ottomans are falling apart, and Russia saw, hey, we can maybe national, nothing brings people together like a war, and so we can maybe get a big upsurge of nationalism and Russian pride by uniting our people against the Ottomans and have them go off to war against the Ottoman Empire. And so Russia tries to, use war as a way to rally their people. They're going to try to take land from the Ottoman. Meanwhile, England and France see this, and they're worried about Russian expansion. They don't want a bigger, more powerful Russia. They don't want Russia moving in and taking over the Ottoman areas. I mean, hindsight, looking back at it, Russia taking over the Ottoman Empire would probably be disastrous for Russia as well, too. But England and France are just living at their time period. They see this and they say, hey, we don't want Russia to be even bigger. And so they go to the aid of the Ottomans. They're not great friends with the Ottomans. They don't have much, other than financial ties because they're loaning a lot of money to the Ottomans and so on. They don't have, much at stake with the Ottomans. They're not, traditionally allies or anything like that. But England and France move in to help the Ottoman Empire. And so the Ottoman Empire, but mainly England and France, are going to fight against Russia in the Crimean War. The Crimean War is sometimes called the First Modern War. Now, we're not at Maxim machine guns yet. This is only the mid-1850s. Those are going to come later. So no machine guns, but there are more modern-style artillery and cannons used. There's also photography. So it's one of the first times we have, battlefield photography. You can also find pictures of, dead bodies and things like that on the battlefield, which is new. Traditionally, if you wanted to know what a battlefield looked like, you would have to read about it in a book or see a painting. Somebody, if they drew a painting, then it would be, of course, an artistic interpretation of what it would be. But here we actually have cameras, so now we have the technology to take pictures. Modern communications, we've already talked about telegraphs, transport, steamships, and things like that, rail that can get people closer to this area. Florence Nightingale, I'm just going to mention her briefly, but Florence Nightingale is kind of seen one of the first like modern nurses and a big change in nursing technology and medical technology. She was involved with the Crimean War as well too. So if you want to do some more research on her, she's related to this time period. And so because of these things like weaponry, modern nursing, photography, faster communication and transportation, we usually saw the first modern war. It's not the first industrial war. That's going to be World War One. It's not the first World War. That's debated between World War One and the 7 Years' War. But it is the first modern war. All right? I know that's weird. You're never going to need to know that for a test, though. Just a little random trivia. So the war is basically right on Russia's border. So here's Russia. Here's Russia. Here's the Ottomans. Here, don't worry about all the rest of this right now. England and France are coming to the aid of the Ottomans. And the war is basically fought on Russia's border. Russia thought that this was going to be easy. They're going to knock around their weaker neighbor and gain some territory, unite their people. Yay. And what actually happened in reality is they were humiliated. They fought a war on their border against a weak neighbor country and lost. And it didn't have much to do necessarily with the Ottomans being great military fighters, but it had a lot to do with England and France being technologically, militaristically superior to Russia. They fought a war on Russia's border and beat Russia. That's humiliating. This shows the obvious superiority of the West, their technology, their military tactics, their way of life, everything. It seems to be that the West is more powerful. Imagine the United States of America, a country that has a big, powerful military and a big, expansive territory. And imagine we went to war with, say, like Cuba or something. And then we lost that war because Cuba got aid from South American countries. That would be humiliating for the United States of America. And the United States of America, the people inside of the country would start to question the government and starting to question, are we going the right way? Maybe there's something we don't know about. And that's the same thing that's going to happen in Russia. And the Crimean War is basically a wake-up call. All right, it's a huge wake-up call for Russia and the Russian people, and the Russian military, and some of the czars. Right, the czars that we're going to talk about are going to be kind of hit or miss, but some of the czars are going to realize that they have to change, or else they are going to crumble, and that their traditional power, their traditional way of life that they were trying to hold on to, can't survive in the modern world. And so Russia is going to try. Sometimes they're going to try to make some changes and become more Western, and then sometimes they're going to go back the other way and try to hold on to the traditional way of life. So we're going to talk a lot about that. A couple of things that come from the Crimean War too. This will lead to them selling Alaska, very similar to how Napoleon, Napoleon lost in Haiti, couldn't retake Haiti, so he sold the Louisiana Purchase to the new country of the United States of America. Very similar thing. Russia loses in the Crimean War. They need cash. They need money. They realize they need this money to pay for their new military reforms and things that they're going to happen. Need to have. What do? Well, they sell Alaska, and so they sell it over to the United States of America. And we already talked about this a little before. When United States of America gets Alaska, many people in America thought it was worthless, just giant, empty, frozen wasteland. Of course, today Alaska, there's a lot of oil. It's a tourist destination. They have cruise lines and stuff that go up there. But back then, people thought it was worthless. So Russia sells Alaska. One of the greatest things for the United States of America is European countries struggling in war, because we end up benefiting from it in terms of our economy or territory. Another famous thing to come out of the Crimean War, you may have heard of this because of the very famous lines here. Charge of the Light Brigade. There's not to make reply, there's not to reason why, there's but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. It's a famous poem from the Crimean War. And that came from there as well too. So the Charge of the Light Brigade. You may have heard this line here, that not there's but to do and die. You've probably heard that before. If not, now you have. And that's where I'm going to stop this video. In the next one, we're going to start to get into how Russia kind of puts one foot into reforms and then takes 2 feet back sometimes. And that'll be for the next video.